What is an illuminated manuscript?
An illuminated manuscript is an illustrated book, and was one of the most important forms of art in medieval Europe and elsewhere, including the Islamic Empire. During the early Middle Ages, European illuminated manuscripts were an important part of Christian missionary activities, and Christian monasteries were at the heart of manuscript production. Specially trained monks, called scribes, wrote text on two different types of animal skin: vellum and parchment, as paper was not common until the 15th century. Medieval illuminators supplemented the text with colorful decoration, often designing large initials and full-color illustrations that took up an entire page. Illuminated manuscripts were very labor-intensive and expensive. The ink alone was worth as much as a semi-precious stone, and sometimes gold leaf was used in the decoration. Manuscripts were sometimes protected with expensive, jewel-encrusted covers, such as the cover of the Lindau Gospels.
What is Fluxus?
Fluxus is a difficult to describe, anti-art movement, sometimes called Neo-Dada. Promoted informally by an international group of artists who were interested in the relationship between art and life. The term Fluxus was invented in 1961 by the Lithuanian-American artist George Maciunas. The word itself comes from Latin and means to flow. Artists associated with Fluxus include, among others, Joseph Beuys, 1921–1986, George Brecht, 1926–2008. Nam June Paik, 1932–2006, Yoko Ono, 1933, and Lamont Young, 1935. An experimental composer and performance artist. The artist Dick Higgins, 1938–1998, created a rubber stamp upon which he explained Fluxus as a way of doing things, a tradition, and a way of life and death, as quoted in Dempsey 229. Fluxus art was inherently collaborative. Artists worked together to create pieces by sending art through the mail, for example. Collaborative Fluxus festivals or Flux concerts featured experimental music and other types of short, fast-paced performances. Fluxus defies narrow description. It was intended to 244 be open, simple, and have a sense of humor.
What is post-painterly abstraction?
The term post-painterly abstraction was coined by influential American art critic Clement Greenberg, 1909–1994, to describe abstract art inspired by but separate from American abstract expressionism. His term encapsulated multiple categories 242 of abstraction, including, but not limited to, hard edge painting and stain painting. Hard edge painting, as exemplified by the work of artists Frank Stella, 1936, and Ellsworth Kelly. 1923, is characterized by large geometric areas of color with absolutely no blending. Colors transition abruptly from one to the next, such as in Stella's Grand Cairo. 1962, a painting composed of a colorful series of ever smaller square outlines. The artist Helen Frankenthaler is known for championing the technique of staining the canvas with pure color. Also considered to be a form of post-painterly abstraction. Post-painterly abstraction emphasizes the formal qualities of painting, such as shape and color. Artists experimented with shaped canvas, transforming the painting into an object, or sculpture. Post-painterly abstraction lasted until the 1970s, when postmodern artists began to challenge the supremacy of modernist critic Clement Greenberg.
What is Arabic calligraphy?
Beautiful calligraphy is very important in Islamic art and is a primary form of fine art and decoration. Calligraphy, or decorative handwriting, is used to decorate not only books and manuscripts, but also carpets, tapestries, and even architectural surfaces. The dome of the Great Mosque at Córdoba, for example, is covered in mosaics which feature the curvilinear Arabic script. In Islam, writing is one of the most elegant and honored forms of art, and is linked to God's revelation to the Prophet Muhammad. In the Quran, God declares, "Recite. Thy Lord is the most generous, who hath taught by means of the pen. Hath taught man what he knew not." Curlxi 8.1 as quoted in Jansen 281.
Is graffiti considered art?
From a postmodern perspective, graffiti is as legitimate a form of visual expression as any form of fine art. Therefore, an oil painting is no more valid than graffiti, and both are considered art. Graffiti, which is often associated with vandalism and the illicit painting or marking of public spaces, has been part of painting for decades, if not longer. Artists such as Jackson Pollock and Jean Dubuffet, for example, incorporated graffiti-like markings into their work. In 1983, the first exhibition of graffiti art was held at Boijmans van Beuningen Museum in Denmark, a sign that graffiti was being accepted as a fine art. The artist Jean-Michel Basquiat, 1960–1988, began his career in the late 1970s as a graffiti artist, tagging buildings with short, poetic phrases, along with this friend, Al Diaz. The duo signed their work as Samo, Same Old Shit. In the 1980s, Basquiat developed a neo-expressionist style that incorporated graffiti elements, explored experimental music, and exhibited his work in galleries in New York City and Los Angeles. Another artist, Keith Haring, 1958–1990, also began his career by using chalk and magic markers to draw his dynamic cartoon images in public spaces, such as New York metro stations. Both Basquiat and Haring have achieved even greater success since their premature deaths. Basquiat of a heroin overdose and Haring of AIDS. As graffiti art and street art have received increasing mainstream attention.
Who is Ai Weiwei?
Ai Weiwei, 1957, is a Chinese contemporary artist and political activist known for working in a variety of media, including painting, sculpture, and installations. Weiwei, who has shown his work internationally, was arrested by Chinese police in 2011 and detained for tax evasion, and has since not been allowed to leave the country or speak publicly about his arrest. Ai Weiwei's work is often political, contemplative, and humorous. Many of his works, such as his Colored Vases, 2006, series, evoke a sense of emptiness.
Who was Benjamin West?
Benjamin West, 1738 to 1820, was an American-born painter who studied in Philadelphia and Rome before establishing a successful career as a history painter in London, making him the first American artist. With such a successful international career, he even served as president of the British Royal Academy of Art after Joshua Reynolds, and was financially supported by a powerful patron, King George III. West's historical paintings strongly adhered to neoclassical conventions, however, in a surprising change from tradition. West's The Death of General Wolfe, 1770, depicted contemporary, rather than historical events, and included images of the king's army wearing their contemporary uniforms, not ancient dress. Although the king, and Joshua Reynolds, aggressively disliked this change, it proved extremely popular amongst the public. The king changed his tune, and named West the royal history painter.
What is a mosque?
A mosque is a Muslim place of public worship, known in Arabic as a masjid. One of the most prominent features of a mosque are its minarets, or calling towers, in which a crier known as a muezzin announces the time for prayer, which occurs 5 times per day as commanded in the second pillar of Islam. Inside a mosque, the Qibla is the wall of the building that faces the city of Mecca, the most important city in Islam. The mihrab is a centrally placed, decorative niche which identifies the Qibla to the worshippers. Other common architectural features of mosques include the minbar, or pulpit, and a fountain for ritual washing, which is done before prayer. Mosque architecture often features grand domes and pointed arches, however. As the religion of Islam is practiced throughout the world, mosque architecture varies greatly depending on culture and geography.
How was the Hagia Sophia converted to a mosque?
When the Ottoman Turks took control over the former Byzantine Empire, the Hagia Sophia, which had been built as a cathedral by Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, was converted into a mosque. The conversion of the Hagia Sophia was an important symbol of power for the conquering ruler, Sultan Mehmed II. Many of the Byzantine mosaics were covered in plaster and certain elements, such as the altar, were removed. Elements of Islamic architecture were incorporated into the building, such as the mihrab, a niche that indicates the direction of Mecca for prayer, as well as the large minarets outside. In the 20th century, the Hagia Sophia became a public museum, and many of the Byzantine mosaics were restored.
What is Schroeder House?
Designed by Dutch architect Gerrit Rietveld, 1888 to 1964. Schroeder House is an example of vestigial architecture. In a way, Schroeder House, built in Utrecht in the Netherlands, is like a three-dimensional Mondrian painting with a geometric interior and exterior. A simplified color palette of neutral and primary colors, and specially designed furniture. The house also features large, rectangular windows and an open floor plan with sliding wall partitions, which emphasize horizontal and vertical lines. The design for Schroeder House inspired a style of architecture known as the International style.
Who was Angelica Kaufmann?
Angelica Kaufmann, 1741 to 1807, was an important neoclassical artist in Britain who studied in Rome, became friends with Joshua Reynolds, and co-founded the Royal Academy of Arts in 1768, though she was forbidden to study the male nude, a fundamental part of academic training to this day. Despite this, Kaufmann painted history paintings, which were held in higher regard than any other form of painting, and was the only 18th-century woman artist to do so. Kaufmann produced Rococoesque, neoclassical history paintings, including Ariadne abandoned by Theseus, 1774, a sleeping nymph watched by a shepherd, 1780, and Cornelia presenting her children as her treasures, c. 1785, which tells a story in the life of one of the most powerful women in ancient Rome. Many of her paintings were reproduced as prints, and she had great success as a portraitist for aristocratic patrons.
What is idealization?
Idealization is the attempt to depict physical perfection in art. For example, classical Greek sculpture, which features immaculately carved human figures, is usually thought of as one of the first traditions of naturalism in art history. Upon closer inspection, however, many examples of classical Greek sculpture look overall quite a bit better than average. Greek gods are depicted with defined muscles, broad shoulders, beautiful hair, and stoic faces. This is arguably similar to our contemporary cultures. Predilection for photoshopping models in glossy magazines. Idealization occurs in art from all over the world. And different cultures emphasize different features in their attempts to achieve perfection.
What is the Pyramid of the Sun?
The Pyramid of the Sun is an Aztec site from pre-classical Mexico. Located in Teotihuacan, near modern-day Mexico City. With a population of 200,000 people, the city of Teotihuacan reached its peak between 350 and 650 CE, similar in size to the Great Pyramid at Giza in Egypt. The Pyramid of the Sun was the most important architectural monument in the city. Aligned with the Avenue of the Dead, the structure was over 200 feet high and 720 feet on each side at the base. Made up of a series of steps, a stairway led to the top where a temple used to sit. The exterior of the building would have been painted and faced a smaller temple called the Pyramid of the Moon.
Who was Salvador Dali?
Salvador Dali, 1904 to 1989, was a Spanish surrealist painter, writer, and filmmaker who gained celebrity status for eclectic art and eccentric behavior, and a curling black mustache. Dali was trained in art at the San Fernando Academy of Fine Arts in Madrid, and his early work exhibits traditional and later Cubist influence. He was a highly skilled realist, though his work was inspired by delirium, and he produced jarring fantastical dreamscapes, often inspired by his Catalonian homeland. Dali called his approach the paranoiac critical method. His goal was to use paranoia to communicate an irrational understanding of reality. An approach quite in line with the overall goals of surrealism, according to the Surrealist Manifesto. Dali's most famous work is The Persistence of Memory, 1931. Other notable paintings include Birth of Liquid Desires, 1931 to 1932, and Soft Construction with Boiled Beans, Premonitions of Civil War, 1936. Dali also created sculptural objects such as Lobster Telephone, 1936, and his long-legged space elephant, which appears in both sculptures and paintings.
What is Tassili Anager?
Tassili Anajar is an approximately 7,000-year-old in southeastern Algeria with thousands of rock paintings and engravings, one of the earliest and most impressive examples of rock art in Africa. During the time when many of the images were made, this section of the Sahara Desert was a grassy plain, and the paintings include images of elephants, hippopotami, and giraffes. Later images depict men, women, and children gathered around small houses, cattle grazing nearby. As the Sahara dried over thousands of years, new animals appear in the rock art, such as camels and horses introduced from nearby Egypt.
Who were the pre-Raphaelites?
Also known as the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, this group, led by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, started out in 1848 as a secret society of students at the Royal Academy School in England who rejected the perceived materialism of the Victorian period as well as the teachings of the Academy. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, which also included William Holman Hunt and John Everett Millais, found the work of the 19th century Academy to be artificial and decadent, and instead preferred the simplicity and apparent sincerity of Renaissance masters such as Fra Angelico and Jan van Eyck. The Pre-Raphaelites also valued the moralistic themes of these artists and favored religious themes. Significant Pre-Raphaelite paintings include Hunt's The Awakening Conscience, 1853 to 1854, Millais Christ in the Carpenter's Shop, Christ in the House of His Parents, 1849 to 1850, and Rossetti's The Girlhood of Mary Virgin, 1849. The Pre-Raphaelites were greatly supported by the English art critic, John Ruskin, were sometimes characterized as romantic, and went on to influence the 174 aesthetic movement, the Symbolists, and Art Nouveau.
What is the work of Ace?
Also known as the carved vase of Uruk, the work of Ace is a 3-foot tall alabaster vase found by archaeologists near the White Temple. The vase is decorated with stories that have been divided into registers, or bands, almost like a comic strip that tells a story of humans making offerings to the gods. The lowest register depicts the natural world of water and plants, while above this are domesticated animals. The middle register features nude men holding baskets, and the top register shows a king giving an offering to the Sumerian goddess Inanna. The figures in the registers are shown with their heads and legs in profile view, but with torsos and shoulders in a 3/4 view.
Who was Le Corbusier?
Le Corbusier, 1887 to 1965, was an architect and designer whose real name was Charles-Édouard Jeanneret. He was also a painter and writer, publishing towards a new architecture. In 1923, Le Corbusier's approach to architecture can be explained in his statement that a house is a machine for living, quoted in Arneson 561. He is known for early home designs and later urban renewal projects. One of his earliest and most famous home designs is the Villa Savoye. Built between 1928 and 1930 in Poissy, France. The rectangular plan of the house allows for long, expansive windows that help to bring the outside in. Raised on pillars, the Villa Savoye is an early attempt to design a domestic space around the use of an automobile, which could be driven and parked under the house. For his urban projects, Le Corbusier believed that architecture could serve as a solution to poverty. He envisioned a total city, in which uniform architectural design would create an ideal living environment. Between 1947 and 1952, he designed the Unité habitation in Marseilles, France, with concrete as a primary building material. The project included duplex apartments along with shops, restaurants, and rooftop park space, a complete community. Le Corbusier's work on the Unité habitation inspired an architectural style named brutalisme.
What is Daoism?
Like Confucianism, Daoism, also spelled Taoism, is also considered to be both a religion and a philosophy, and is native to China. Daoist philosophy is more metaphysically focused than Confucianism, and emphasizes intuition and developing a harmonious relationship with nature. It is founded upon the teachings of two ancient philosophers named Laozi and Zhuangzi. The word Dao means the ultimate way and is symbolically linked to water. Water is yielding and moves gently around obstacles. But it is also strong, it can turn even the largest stones into sand.
What is installation art?
The term installation art developed in the 1970s and refers to art designed for a particular space, usually an indoor space, and is usually temporary. Installation art can incorporate sculpture, video, performance, and mixed media. In a way, installation art conceives of a museum or gallery exhibition space as a work of art in and of itself, and viewer interaction with the space is at the core of the form. Installations often have specific themes and messages and can be designed by a single artist or a group. Artists who have created notable installations include Rachel White-Reed, Ai Weiwei, and Jenny Halser. The artist Sylvain Guier even includes elements of smell in her installation work. For more examples, see the chapter on Contemporary Art 1960s to present.
What is Moctezuma's crown?
Moctezuma was the Aztec leader at the time of the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire, led by Hernán Cortés. His crown was made of colorful feathers, from birds such as macaw parrots and the quetzal bird, which were gathered into bunches and then sewn into a reed frame studded with precious stones. The long feathers of Moctezuma's crown are dark green and the reed frame is painted in bright reds and light blues. The provenance of the crown has come under much scholarly debate, but there is evidence that the crown was given to Cortés by Moctezuma himself. The crown was sent back to Europe on one of Cortés' ships and given to Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain. The headdress is currently in Austria, and negotiations are underway for the Austrian government to loan the crown back to Mexico for the first time in over 500 years.
What was the Harlem Renaissance?
The Harlem Renaissance was a cultural movement that grew from the 19th century New Negro movement. Intellectuals such as Alain Locke, 1886–1954, called on black artists, writers, musicians, and thinkers to draw inspiration from their African roots rather than white European traditions. Blues and jazz, played by musicians such as Bessie Smith and Duke Ellington, and poetry by writers such as Langston Hughes, were part of a cultural explosion that centered on the New York City urban experience. Visual artists, including the photographer James Van Der Zee, and painters Palmer Hayden, 1890–1964, and Aaron Douglas, whose painting aspects of Negro life, from slavery through Reconstruction, 1934, is an example of the influence of African art styles on black artists during the Harlem Renaissance. The painting represents the history of black Americans and is populated with figurative silhouettes reminiscent of ancient Egyptian paintings. With a limited color palette, Douglas' painting is filled with energy, movement, and sound in its depiction of the Emancipation Proclamation, Civil War Reconstruction, and voting rights. At the far left of the scene, the Ku Klux Klan threaten on horseback. But repeating circles draw attention to a triumphant figure at the center, who holds a ballot in his hand.
What is a pagoda?
Derived from the Indian stupa. A pagoda is a tall tower notable for its repeated rooflines featuring upturned eaves. Pagodas are one of the most recognizable examples of East Asian architecture, often found at the center of Buddhist temple complexes. Early pagodas were solid structures and therefore could not be entered, and were made of stone, brick, and wood. The Fa Guang Si Pagoda in Yingxian, China, built in 1056 and designed to house relics, is still the tallest wooden building in the world, at 9 stories.
How did Brunelleschi build the dome of the Florence Cathedral?
As civic projects boomed in the wealthy city of Florence, architects imagined building a huge dome on top of the Florence Cathedral as a way of glorifying their city. Though he had lost the Baptistery doors design competition earlier, Filippo Brunelleschi was hired to build the dome, which needed to be 138 feet across, bigger than the Pantheon in Rome. It was not an easy task, and Brunelleschi was only 24 years old at the time. After studying Roman ruins, including the Pantheon, Brunelleschi built an octagonal double-shell dome. The inner layer of bricks was arranged in ever-tapering circular rows, which allowed each row of bricks to support the next. The bricks of the outer shell were arranged in a strong herringbone pattern. The 8 sides of the dome were further supported by ribs and metal bands. Brunelleschi faced another significant challenge: how were the workers going to build this thing? Usually, a dome would be constructed with the aid of scaffolding. But the space to be covered was so big that no trees were long enough. Instead, Brunelleschi devised a system of smaller scaffolds and platforms for workers, along with hoisting systems, and even elevated canteens so that workers could take their lunch break without climbing back down to the ground. It is no wonder that Brunelleschi is considered to be the father of Renaissance architecture.
What is the sublime?
During the 18th century, philosophers established 3 different categories of aesthetics: the beautiful, the picturesque, and the sublime. In 1763, Immanuel Kant, philosopher of the German Enlightenment, wrote observations on the feeling of the beautiful and sublime, and in this treatise, he described beauty as relating to formal harmony, while the sublime related to intangible awe and a feeling of being overwhelmed. Edward Burke explained the concept of the sublime in the Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful, 1957, when he wrote, "Whatever is fitted in any sort to excite the ideas of pain and danger, that is to say, whatever is in any sort terrible, is the source of the sublime," as quoted in Pierce 93. An interest in the grandeur and vastness of the aesthetic experience, the concept of the sublime mirrored the values and interests of the Romantic movement, emphasizing emotion, mystery, and the imagination.
What is Great Zimbabwe?
Great Zimbabwe was an important capital city of the Bantu-speaking Shona people between the 12th and 15th centuries, reaching its peak between 1250 and 1450 with an estimated population of approximately 15,000 people and control over a large territory, covering an area of nearly 2,000 acres. The ruined city of Great Zimbabwe is principally comprised of 3 structures: the hill complex, the valley ruins, and the great enclosure, which are surrounded by a large protective wall, nearly 30 feet tall. The great enclosure, which dates from the mid-14th to 15th century, was made with a special pattern of dry stone blocks, a technique still used by contemporary builders, and is the largest stone structure in sub-Saharan Africa. Many sculpture and pottery fragments have been found at the Great Zimbabwe site, indicating a rich art culture. A popular material for sculpture was soapstone, and many examples of soapstone bird carvings have been discovered, though the exact significance of these sculptures is still unknown.
What is the difference between action painting and color field painting?
Action painting is a type of abstract expressionism with close ties to surrealist automatism. It is sometimes also called gestural painting or gestural abstraction. Action painting is improvisational and emphasizes uncontrolled creativity and the process of painting itself. The three main artists associated with action painting are Willem de Kooning, Frans Klein, and Jackson Pollock, whose works emphasize the physical nature of their creation through large, often frenetic brush strokes, visible paint drips, and aggressive style. For example, Jackson Pollock painted Eyes in Heat, 1946. By squeezing liquid paint directly onto the canvas from the tube and then smearing it. The result is a highly textured canvas filled with swirling painted forms. Color field painting is somewhat less aggressive than action painting, though no less emotionally impactful. Color field painting is characterized by large, abstract areas of solid color. As seen in the work of Mark Rothko, Barnett Newman, Robert Motherwell, Clifford Still, and Helen Frankenthaler. Helen Frankenthaler even stained her canvases with color. Both action painters and color field painters believed that their works were in no way devoid of subject matter, but that color and action were essential to creative expression.
What is painting?
Paint is a liquid mixture made of pigment, often a powder, and a binding agent such as water or oil. A painting is a two-dimensional surface, such as stretched canvas or wood panel, to which paint has been artistically applied. A wall mural, or a fresco, is also considered to be a painting, as is work on paper, such as an illuminated book manuscript or a hand scroll. Some of the most common types of paints used are oil paints, egg yolk tempera, often used in Italy during the Renaissance, watercolors and acrylics, a modern, water-soluble paint.
What is Mosaic art?
Mosane art is a Romanesque style of art greatly influenced by classical sources and associated with the Meuse Valley region, which reaches from France to the Netherlands along the path of the Meuse River. The terms encompasses architecture, painting, and sculpture. Though 12th century Meuse Valley sculptors are particularly known for their mastery of metalworking, Mosane art is considered less abstract than the Romanesque art of other regions, featuring realistic anatomy and proportions, as opposed to the elongated figures of Gisli Berthoud's.
What was the Sulhache movement?
The Sulhache movement was a Korean style of painting that developed during the 18th century and was inspired by a newfound focus on Korean identity and Confucianism. Chong Sun, 1676–1759, was a celebrated Korean painter and was a leading member of the Sulhache movement. He was active during the middle of the Choson dynasty, which lasted from 1392 until 1910 and had its capital at Seoul, now the capital of South Korea. Chong Sun was inspired by Chinese literati painting and is known for his ink paintings of mountain scenes, especially paintings of the Diamond Mountains, which he made with dark, textured brush strokes. Like the literati painters, Chong Sun was interested in capturing a true view, or realistic depiction, of the natural world.
What tools did Paleolithic artists use?
Paleolithic artists used natural minerals to produce pigments in colors such as red, ochre, black, and brown. It is possible that these artists applied some of these pigments directly to the walls with their hands, but hollowed bones were likely used to spray paint onto the walls. Pigment-covered hollow bones have been found near some of the paintings by archaeologists. Other tools include chunks of moss or animal hair that would have served as a type of paintbrush. For carving, pieces of flint were used to make engraved lines.
What did ancient Chinese architecture look like?
While no ancient Chinese buildings remain standing today, houses and palaces from the Han Dynasty, 206 B. C.E-220 CE, survive in ceramic models. They were made for Han tombs and give scholars an idea of what the architecture of the time would have looked like. Han buildings were made of wood and were notable for their curved roofs and jutting eaves. The weight of Han buildings were supported by a system of vertical and horizontal beams, which meant that the walls did not need to bear any of the structure's weight. Colorfully painted screens, usually red and black, were used to separate rooms. The rest of the wood structure was either painted or lacquered, which helped to protect it from the elements.
What is the significance of the meeting house in Pacific cultures?
Meeting or ceremonial houses are a significant part of Pacific architecture. And many Pacific cultures use these larger halls or houses for religious or rite of passage ceremonies. For example, the Abalam people of the East Sepik province in New Guinea display art and ritual objects in ceremonial houses in order to attract spirits during rituals. Abalam ceremonial houses are traditionally decorated with art objects made in a variety of materials, including fruit, leaves, stones, and shells. On the island of New Ireland, ceremonial houses are essential for Malagan. Ceremonies and wood sculptures are carved and displayed at the front of the house. In the mid-19th century, master carver Rahara Hirukipo supervised the construction of Te Haukituranga, a Maori meeting house in Gisborne, New Zealand. The house, a type known as a warinui, is covered in detailed high-relief wood carvings that have been rubbed with shark liver oil and red clay to produce rich color and luminescence. Along the 234 A-frame ceiling, is a repeating pattern of painted wood rafters and lattice panels, which were made by women artisans. Though the nature of the carvings is traditional, they were done with European-style metal tools during a time in the colonial 19th century. As Maori architecture was changing under the influence of Christianity, meeting houses across the Pacific serve as important locations for community meetings, rituals, and other ceremonial uses. Their construction is inextricably related to the creation of art objects, and to both the political and spiritual function they serve within a culture.
How was single-point perspective invented?
Quite literally a Renaissance man, Filippo Brunelleschi was a goldsmith, clockmaker, mathematician, Latin scholar, and architect. It just so happens that he also invented single-point perspective, one of the most important technical innovations of the Renaissance, also known as linear perspective. Single-point perspective is a mathematical system based on natural observation. Under the rules of single-point perspective, distant objects are depicted smaller than objects closer to the viewer, while the far edges of similarly shaped objects appear shorter near the edges. This warping of forms is known as foreshortening. Brunelleschi invented the idea of a picture plane, in which he imagined the frame of a painting as a window through which the viewer sees an illusion of three-dimensional space. The artist lays out the scene according to a grid pattern, and every object in the picture, for example architectural objects like rooflines and walls, follow invisible lines called orthogonals, which converge at a single point, known as the vanishing point, usually at eye level to the viewer. Strangely enough, Brunelleschi was primarily interested in perspective not as a painter, but as an architect. His goal was to design an interior that drew a person's attention through a space, such as a church nave, towards the altar, which he did effectively in his design for the Santo Spirito in Florence in 1434.
What is the animal style?
Animal style is a term art historians use to describe the zoomorphic or animal-based design motifs popular among Anglo-Saxon artisans during the medieval period. In the animal style, abstract animal motifs merge with geometric and organic motifs, creating a lively and intricate pattern, especially in metalwork. One of the most famous examples of the animal style is a purse cover from the Sutton Hoo burial ship. The purse cover is about 8 inches long and would have been used to cover a leather pouch for carrying coins. The purse was designed with interweaving bands of gold, surrounding deep blue and red plagues of enamel and garnet. A pair of highly stylized human figures with splayed legs are each flanked by a pair of wolves. Serpentine lines undulate around the curving form of the purse cover, broken into rhythmic rectangles. A study of Anglo-Saxon decorative arts, such as the Sutton Hoo purse cover, show the influence of many medieval cultures, such as Germanic tribes, Vikings, and Christians.
Who was Mondrian?
Piet Mondrian, 1872 to 1944, was a Dutch painter who made significant contributions to 20th century abstraction, especially geometric abstraction. He was an important part of the vestigial movement, and he is most well known for paintings that depict flat, geometric grids in neutral and primary colors. During his early career, Mondrian's art was not totally abstract. Paintings such as Still Life with Ginger Pot, 1911, and Grey Tree, 1912, show the artist's early flirtation with Cubism, and even earlier works such as Mill at Evening, 1905, are linked to the Dutch landscape tradition. Mondrian's style changed throughout his career. He was influenced by Cubism, but believed that the goal of painting should be complete abstraction as a vehicle for communicating reality. He supported the idea that color and form could impose pure reality on the viewer in what he called plastic expression. According to Mondrian, a work of art needed to balance movement, form, and color in order to achieve this reality, an aesthetic philosophy called neoplasticism. Mondrian's paintings, such as composition with large red plain, yellow, black, gray and blue, 1921, are meticulously painted to achieve the utmost informal balance and produce dynamic energy, a sense of depth, and a balance between simplicity and complexity.
What are the major periods of Greek art?
The Greek civilization developed in the Mediterranean before 1000 BCE and flourished until conquered by the Romans in the 1st century BCE. During this 1000-year time span, the Greeks produced art and architecture. Considered to be the foundation of all Western art to come after it. Scholars divide Greek art history into a number of periods, or categories. The most significant of which include the geometric, archaic, classical, and Hellenistic periods.
What is the Renaissance?
The word Renaissance is a French word meaning rebirth. The Renaissance is generally considered to be a rebirth of classical, Greco-Roman, culture, which resurfaced after the dark days following the fall of the Roman Empire in the 4th century. This, however, is an oversimplification. Changes such as the development of cities, a growing European economy, and strong support for the arts by wealthy patrons all contributed to the birth of the Renaissance. The balanced, harmonious, and naturalistic paintings associated with the Renaissance did not burst onto the art and culture scene of Europe overnight. It happened slowly over the course of the 14th and 15th centuries. Beginning in Florence, Italy, and was at least partly inspired by a newfound interest in translating classical Greek manuscripts, and the study of Roman ruins.
Who was Paul Gauguin?
One of the most famous of the French post-impressionists, Paul Gauguin. 1848 to 1903, struggled to find critical success during his lifetime, but is now considered to be an innovator who made a major impact on early 20th century modern art. He was primarily a painter, but also worked in sculpture, ceramics, printmaking, and writing. Gauguin identified with the 19th century symbolist movement, and his bold, flatly colored paintings often hold significant symbolic meaning. In 1891, he expressed a desire to shed the corrupting influence of modern civilization and fled to Tahiti, where he spent the majority of the rest of his life living in poverty and working on paintings infused with symbolism, mythology, and Tahitian subject matter, in what is considered a precursor of primitivism. Even before leaving for French Polynesia, Gauguin's work shows evidence of inspiration from folk art. His painting The Yellow Christ, 1889, depicts the crucifixion in Brittany, in northern France. Local women encircle Christ, kneeling in prayer. The bold, flat colors of the painting are reminiscent of medieval Christian painting and emphasize the power and intangibility of prayer. Later works include Tea no Areois, The Seed of the Areoi, 1892. Two Tahitian Women, 1899, and Nevermore, 1897, a painting that mixes the influence of Edgar Allan Poe, the traditional female nude, and Tahitian imagery.
What is art for art's sake?
During the 19th century, there was, and continues to be, a debate about the role and function of art in society. The term art for art's sake was first coined by Victor Cousins, a French philosopher, and reflects the tenets of aestheticism, which is centered on the idea that there is no purpose for art other than beauty. There were some critics of this idea. Karl Marx, for example, thought that art is a reflection of social class and has the power to make political change. The foremost English art critic, John Ruskin, believed that art had both political and social significance and therefore had a purpose more far-reaching than beauty alone.
Who was Grandma Moses?
Anna May Moses, better known as Grandma Moses, 1860 to 1961, didn't begin painting until she was in her 70s. When her arthritis was so bad that she could no longer sew. She is an example of a so-called naive artist, or a self-taught artist who has not been academically trained. Grandma Moses lived in rural New York, and first had her art displayed in a local drugstore, where she was discovered by an art collector. Her first solo show, held in 1940, was called What a Farm Wife Painted. Her work, primarily nostalgic landscapes of familiar places such as upstate New York, Vermont, and Virginia, became immensely popular, and has been copied in multiple formats from greeting cards to wallpaper to postage stamps. Among her collection of over 1,000 paintings are The Old Checkered House, 18th April 1949, and Down on the Farm in Winter, 1945, which are filled with small, lively figures and provide a nostalgic view of rural America.
What is the Mayan Codex style?
Artists, held in high regard in Mayan society, wrote hieroglyphs and made illustrations in ancient folded books called codices. There is a clear link between the style of the art produced in these codices and other types of art, such as painted ceramics. Mayan Codex style art is filled with expressive characters and bold colors. These paintings, whether in a book or on a vessel, have text which helps to explain the meaning of the images. These hieroglyphic inscriptions sometimes represent images, and are therefore pictographic, and sometimes represent sounds. A system of dots and bars was used to mark time. Scholars think it was common for the writing and the illustrations to have been completed by the same person, and refer to them as artist scribes.
Who was Jacques-Louis David?
Jacques-Louis David, 1748 to 1825, was arguably the most important French painter working in the neoclassical style, whose art first exemplified the values of the French Revolution, and then the imperial style of Emperor Napoleon. In his history paintings, such as the Oath of the Artei, 1784, David depicted patriotic Roman scenes, which emphasized themes of sacrifice and heroism, and captured the spirit of the revolution. His 1793 painting, The Death of Marat, which was commissioned during the Bloody Reign of Terror, commemorates the bloody death of Jean-Pierre Marat, a Jacobin journalist and politician murdered while in the bathtub by a woman aligned with the Girondins, an opposing political faction. Marat was known to have a debilitating skin disease, and often worked while soaking in the bathtub. The painting idealizes Marat, whose body slumps over the edge of the tub, which is presented in a minimalist fashion against a simple bathroom. Quite unlike Marat's real bathroom, which was rather more opulent. In his left hand, Marat still holds a handwritten note, while in his right hand, a quill. Nearby is the bloody knife that the assassin, Charlotte Corday, had used to stab him through the chest. David belonged to the same political party as Marat, and this painting clearly serves as political propaganda. Once the revolution was over, David's political fortunes rose and fell. He served a short time in prison, and then as the president. But, he eventually aligned himself with a new power, Napoleon Bonaparte, who ruled over France from 1804 to 1815, and became an important patron for David.
What were Ashoka's pillars?
Ashoka was considered one of the greatest emperors of the Iron Age Maurya Empire. Located in the eastern portion of modern-day India, Ashoka converted to Buddhism, formalized a legal code according to Buddhist principles, and spread Buddhist teachings across his land by inscribing monolithic stones with his code. These stone pillars reached as high as 40 feet tall and are said to symbolize the axis mundi, or the axis of the world. The pillars mark the coming together of heaven and earth, as well as pilgrimage sites associated with the Buddha. The tops of the pillars were elaborately carved and often depict back-to-back open-mouthed lions, which proclaim Buddha's message for all who will listen.
What is chinoiserie?
The word chinoiserie comes from French and roughly translates to Chinese-esque. As European explorers reached increasingly distant locations across the globe during the 17th and 18th centuries, Europe became more and more exposed to diverse art and culture. Chinese art was particularly popular during the 19th century. and the wealthy collected Chinese porcelain, sculpture, and other decorative arts. European artists eventually began to incorporate Chinese design elements into their own decorative arts. In 1762, a 10-story Chinese-style pagoda was built in Kew Gardens in London, and serves as an example of both the Rococo aesthetic and Western interest in Asian style.
What are the Nazca lines?
The Nazca lines are monumental geoglyphs carved lightly into the earth in southern Peru, and were made by the Nazca culture between around 400 and 600 C. The lines form symbolic shapes, including animals, and natural and geometric forms, such as a hummingbird, monkey, lizard, a flower, tree, and a spiral and trapezoid. These shapes, some of which are over 400 feet long, were made by removing a top layer of red pebbled earth to reveal a whiter surface underneath. Scholars wonder if the Nazca geoglyphs were depictions of constellations, or in some way linked to astronomy, but no conclusive connection has been found. It is possible the Nazca lines were an important part of religious ritual, or were intended for a divine audience, as they are best seen from the air.
What is art brut?
Art brut, meaning raw art, is a term coined by French painter Jean Dubuffet, 1901 to 1985, in 1945 to describe outsider art, or art made by individuals without academic training, including the art of children, criminals, and the mentally ill. Along with surrealist André Breton and art critic Michel Tapie, Dubuffet founded the company de l'Art Brut, which collected art brut created by Swiss mental patients. This collection grew to over 2,000 works and was later donated by Dubuffet to the Swiss city of Lausanne. In 1971, Dubuffet, whose own art was greatly inspired by outsider art, was interested in spontaneity, originality, and freedom from the social constraints of art production.
What is the ecstasy of St. Teresa?
The ecstasy of St. Teresa is a central sculpture in the Cornaro Chapel in the Church of Santa Maria della Vittoria in Rome. It is considered to be a masterpiece of Baroque sculpture and was made by Gian Lorenzo Bernini between 1645 and 1652. The sculpture depicts Saint Teresa of Avila, who in life experienced powerful visions. In her writing, Saint Teresa describes an encounter with an angel who stabbed her in the 138th heart with a golden spear. She believed the experience was an encounter with God. Bernini's complex sculpture, which dominates the chapel space, depicts this vision. Within an elevated niche, Saint Teresa seems to float amidst her undulating robes. Her toes peek out from underneath the mass of fabric, curling in a combination of pain and pleasure during this divine encounter. Her mouth is open and her head tilts back as a small angel gingerly grasps at her clothes with one hand and grips a golden spear in the other. The spear points directly at her breast. The figures appear to float because they are supported by a hidden cantilevered mass of marble. Mirroring the spear, bronze beams of light descend upon the pair from above, helping to frame the scene from within the niche and emphasize the presence of the divine. In other parts of the chapel, marble bystanders watch from theater boxes, in awe. The sculpture is like a frozen theater piece. It is a highly illusionistic depiction of the pleasure and pain of Saint Teresa, and a surprisingly sensual representation of the divine.